Modern World History Final Project Podcast. Take 1. I have a quote here from the World War II, Volume 28, Issue 5, written by Mark Grimsley. At Versailles, two issues predominated. The first, what to do about Germany. Two basic responses were possible. A lenient peace based on no annexations or indemnities, as President Woodrow Wilson pointed in his famous speech, The 14 Points. Or a punitive peace that rendered Germany incapable of making mischief. The second major question, what to do about the multi-ethnic stew created by the Austro-Hungarian Empire's collapse. Here a second major element in the Wilsonian formula for peace became central, self-determination. Serbian nationalism had helped trigger the Great War. Now, other ethnic groups' nationalist aspirations promised to keep Europe in turmoil unless those aspirations were satisfied. For that reason, the Versailles settlement divided Eastern and South Central Europe into a mosaic of small nation-states such as Austria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and above all, Poland. Again, World War II, Volume 28, Issue 5, author Mark Grimsley. So, in the modern day, a lot of these details can be disagreed upon. Details pertaining to the war itself, the discussions and agreements and terms of the treaty, and what those terms would actually lead to in the future. For the most part, it is considered crucial to the beginning of World War II, and the war to end all wars would not be that at all because of this peace treaty. For example, in the modern day, our president, Joe Biden, actually just got into a dispute with the Prime Minister of Turkey over whether or not the Armenian genocide at the hands of the Ottoman Empire was in fact a genocide. This isn't necessarily crucial to the focus of this podcast, but it does serve as a good example of how different experts will share disagreements about something that happened so long ago. Being a 22-year-old born just before the start of the 21st century, I say I'm far enough removed from the events to hold any contempt for any parties involved, really. I think that I can present the facts and the sources that I've gathered without any sense of partial opinion. But the peace treaty was held from January 19th, 1999 to January 21st, 1920. It was held at the Palace of Versailles, just outside of Paris, France. The key elements of the Treaty of Versailles that I would like to focus on would be Woodrow Wilson's Wilsonianism or Wilsonian nationalism, France's bone to pick, mainly through reparations, the League of Nations, which was the crux of Wilsonianism, and the disarmament/partitioning of Germany. This would consist of limiting the power of the German army and dividing up a lot of German territory in the mainland German borders and outside, which would heavily damage national pride. In fact, Germany was never fully invaded by the Allies, to preface. They signed an armistice shortly after the U.S. got involved in the war. And on the subject of national pride, this event would actually open up the opportunity for narratives to prevail, such as Germany did not lose the war, or the leaders of Germany at that time were incapable of completing the German vision. This narrative would be picked up and brought to light by later nationalists that we'll learn about soon. Nationalism actually prevailed throughout a significant portion of Europe during and after the terms of the treaty. New states arose out of previous borders, and a lot of that territory actually came from Germany. Lots of these states, such as Poland, were newly realized ethnic states, but ethnic realization did not come to pass in Germany, nor did national realization, as they had given up a lot of territory under the Treaty of Versailles, including their capital city, Berlin. New borders were formed around the city to produce the Weimar Republic. The four categories of the Treaty of Versailles as it pertains to Germany consist of territorial arrangements, disarmament, financial reparations, and the League of Nations. As far as a surface level observation of the territorial arrangements, Germany lost 65,000 kilometers of territory from its borders, including the return of Alsace-Lorraine to France. This was a territory that was taken by Prussia in the 1870s. This also included the cessation of several German territories into their own states and the partitioning of all German colonies to the League of Nations. On the topic of disarmament, it was decided that Germany could maintain an army of no more than 100,000 men, which was thought to be substantial for its defense, but not its offense, which was the point. The financial reparations imposed were to the tune of 94 million. We'll get into more of that later. And the formation of the League of Nations. This was the crux of Wilson's vision and the 14th article of the 14 points. In fact, Wilson actually begrudgingly agreed to the treaty on the condition that the League of Nations would be formed. Again, more on that later. On the topic of France's ideas under, at that time, Premier Georges Clemenceau, France wanted to impose massive reparations on Germany as they were at the mercy of much destruction in World War I. In fact, most of the fighting actually took place on French soil. I've got a quote here to show that. 20,000 industrial compounds were destroyed or damaged. 2.5 million agricultural sectors were devastated. 2,000 kilometers of canals and 2,000 individual bridges were destroyed or damaged as well. 62,000 kilometers of road and more than 5,000 kilometers of railroad were, quote, all out of order in France. And these figures come from the International Encyclopedia of the First World War. Again, on France's ideas, Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles is widely regarded nowadays as the guilt clause. This guilt clause placed all blame on Germany for the war and originally levied $33 billion in reparations on the state of Germany, accounting for inflation that is now $578.9 billion. This was eventually reduced to the earlier figure quoted, 94 million, again adjusting for inflation that is $1.65 billion. And in pre-Great Depression times, before inflation really came about, this was a massive, massive figure for the German government to pay off in its weakened state. These figures and their inflated figures, I quote from the CPI inflation calculator. Germany was actually pressured to agree to these terms: the reparation, the expansion and cessation of territories, the shifting borders. Pretty much everything was begrudgingly agreed to on their behalf. It was thought by most parties involved that Germany did not have a place in these discussions, and Germany was not represented in any way in these discussions. They were pretty much strong-armed into agreeing to these terms. Again, this would cause the German people to kind of dissent on their leadership and would open the door to, again, more narratives in the future for nationalists to exploit. As far as America's input under President Woodrow Wilson, on January 18th, 1918, Woodrow Wilson delivered a speech to Congress based on his concept known as the 14 points. He would carry this concept into debates on the treaty. According to the Oxford University Press, on a review of the Versailles Treaty and its legacy, The Failure of Wilsonian Vision, which is a book, quote, the authors blame Wilsonian's utopian concept of collective security for its lack of realism. Obviously, that can be seen as an opinionated statement, but it is very much widely regarded as a utopian vision. Its ambitions are eerily similar to some of the socialist communist ambitions that were going on in Russia at the time, and was largely regarded as impossible. And many of these 14 points would not come about, but the 14th article of such would be something that Woodrow Wilson very, very intently pushed and was actually what pushed him to represent America and signed this treaty because it was, in fact, included in the final draft of the Treaty of Versailles. I will quickly summarize the 14 points. Article 1. Peace agreements arrived at openly and publicly between nations. No future private agreements between states. 2. Absolute freedom of navigation on the seas unless seas are closed by an international council. Removal of international trade barriers and equitable trade between all nations involved in this agreement. Number 4, guarantees that all individual nations will be armed only to a degree needed for defense in the future in the final draft of the treaty. This would really only be imposed on Germany, but Wilson saw this as necessary for all states involved in the treaty. 5, a free, open-minded, impartial adjustment to all colonial claims with states set to be partitioned in a sense of equitability. Britain strongly opposed this point, as they were striving to regain colonial claims lost in the war, such as India and sub-Saharan Africa. 6. Evacuation of Russian territories and cooperative international dialogue to determine national policy for the state. This was in the wake of the first Red Scare, known as the Bolshevik Revolution. 7. Belgium to be evacuated and restored without any attempt to limit sovereignty of the state. 8. All French territory to be restored unto France, including Alsace-Lorraine, which again was taken by Prussia in 1878. This would actually come to pass in the final draft. 9. A more precise adjustment to Italy's borders. 10. Autonomy to the respective states of Austria-Hungary. This actually would occur as the Austria-Hungarian Empire would be separated into several states, but Austria and Hungary would become respective states of their own. 11. The Balkan states, Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro, would be required to discuss national lines diplomatically and become their own respective states. 12. Turkish portion of the Ottoman Empire, aka Turkey, to become an autonomous state, yet it must not interfere with the autonomy or rights of all nationalities and ethnic groups within the new state borders. 13. Erection of a Polish state that would cover all populations indisputably of Polish descent. And 14. Establishment of the League of Nations to deter imperialism and further global conflict. 12, 13, and 14 would all come to pass. Turkey would be its own state, Poland would be its own state, and the establishment of the League of Nations would come to pass. Although some of these articles would come to fruition and others would not, it seemed that Wilson was most intent on forming the League of Nations and signed this treaty on America's behalf based on that condition, although the U.S. Senate would vote not to join. And lastly, I would like to focus on the results of the final draft in a little bit more detail and the eventual next war that it would lead to. The former empire of Austria-Hungary was dissolved and new nations were created from its land, Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. The Ottoman Empire lost the majority of its colonial property and the remaining territory became Turkey. Portions of Russia, Germany, and the Austria-Hungarian Empire were partitioned to create the state of Poland. The Weimar Republic formed as an independent state around Berlin. Russian land yielded the new nations of Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. The nationalist sentiment of Wilsonianism prevailed among newly formed and territorially reimbursed states such as Poland, France, and several new states. However, this would strongly contrast with Germany's end result of the treaty. Among all the national pride provided for new states in the guilt clause would pin all of the blame of the war on Germany. This would again further dismantle German pride and produce dissent not only on the treaty, but on the impotence of their own government. Germany was directly disarmed, while the Wilsonian vision of reducing all nations' arms did not come to bear fruit, yet another strong contrast for the German people. Well, quote, while the Treaty of Versailles formally ended the most destructive war in history up to that point, the negotiated settlement left all parties unsatisfied. The Germans were deeply resentful of the heavy reparations and disarmament. France was concerned that Germany was not weakened enough, and American leaders worried that the flawed treaty would lead to future wars. That is an excerpt from World War I. The Treaty of Versailles was the peace settlement too harsh. Most scholars regard the Wilsonian vision as utopian and impractical. However, the French alternative would prove to end as badly as anyone could have postulated for the former. The German government printed its reparation funds rather than tax it from a broken people. This would crash the Western and Eastern European economy, which was borrowing large sums of money from the booming U.S. economy to rebuild damaged territory. So from the east to the west, this inflation would lead to a global depression and the crash of the U.S. stock market, and this is known as the Great Depression. During this development, a young Adolf Hitler had just joined the German Workers' Party. He began giving speeches berating the agreed-upon settlements and sentiments of the Treaty of Versailles. He was arrested by his government for treason in 1923 due to what is known as the Beer Hall Putsch. This was a radical attempt to overthrow the government through force. This would draw major attention to himself and his autobiography, Mein Kampf, which translates to My Struggle. This would also draw attention to his newly formed nationalist extremist party dubbed the Nazi Party. Upon his release from prison, he continued campaigning on the griefs of the German people. Using Jews as this all-powerful straw man, his narrative served to direct German resentment in a very particular direction. This popularity surge would eventually put him in power. In 1933, he became Chancellor of Germany and immediately turned it into a dictatorship. The rest is history. The Weimar Republic, a German experiment of democracy, would not stand the test of Nazi fascism. In 1939, the briefly curtailed consequences of an unequal treaty would come to fruition with the invasion of Poland. The war to end all wars and agreements, or lack of agreement therein, had culminated into something even darker than our world's first global conflict.